Everyone. Again, we're sticking with our Ed puzzle format for the indefinite future, I guess. Um, so remember last class we began our little chapter on the Hebrew people and the Israelites, and as just sort of a recap, the sequence of events is kind of Abraham is the first Jew. He makes this promise with God. He says that you know, God, I will worship you and only you, and my people will worship you and only you. And God says, in exchange for that, we'll look after you. I'll look after you. I'll give you kind of this promised land, which we know is Israel, and we'll make sure there's peace and prosperity. So Abraham and his descendants, they live for hundreds and hundreds of years in Israel until eventually they start spreading out and they end up in Egypt. And in Egypt, they become slaves to the pharaohs, right? The pharaohs use them as slaves to build their temples and to do their farming and all of that stuff. And that lasts for another several hundred years until eventually um, Moses comes along as a leader of the Jewish people. And that's where the story of Passover and the plagues and eventually the Ten Commandments comes in because Moses leads the Jewish people out of Egypt. They wander the desert for 40 years. They wind up back in Israel um, and establish these 12 tribes or 12 families. So these are 12 different families that all descend from Abraham, right? So Abraham is kind of the guy. He's the first Jew. He has kids, and they have kids, and they have kids, and eventually it turns into these 12 families that settle down in Israel. What this page is talking about, and we really don't have to go um, through this word for word, but what this page is talking about is that those 12 families and tribes, for the most part, they got along, but they have different ideas about how to run things and how to do things. And they also have to deal with outside enemies called Philistines, who live in the area and kind of want to do things their own way, and so they fight and all that. And so the Jewish people realize, yeah, we've got 12 tribes, but we need one person to sort of run the show, to unite us, to help us fight off our enemies. And so they choose a king, right? And so they name this guy named Saul to be the ruler of the Hebrew people. And he's going to unite the tribes and fight off their enemies and build up their wealth, and life will be good, right? And so Saul dies, and eventually this guy named David becomes king. And again, David kind of continues the work that Saul set out to do. And his key accomplishment is that he takes Jerusalem back from the Philistines and turns it into the capital of his kingdom, right, of Israel. And it's at this point that Jerusalem really starts to take off and become um, kind of, as the book says, one of the most important historical cities in the world, in human history. Um, Eventually, David dies, and his son inherits this kingdom. It's peaceful. They're, again, like we saw in Egypt, they're building stuff up, lots of public works, temples, markets, trade, stuff like that. The problem is that Solomon kind of favors the uh, the southern people of Israel, right? The people in northern Israel feel that the taxes they're paying are too high. They're not getting enough of a big enough slice of the pie, so to speak. Um, and so eventually, a war breaks out between these northern and southern tribes, and you have Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Um, and as the book says here, the northern kingdom has 10 of those original tribes, and the southern kingdom has two. Um, Eventually, the fighting kind of subsides, the fighting ends, and they're able to unite again. And where we get the word Judaism is from that uh, that area of Israel called Judah. Okay. So I will read this section because this is just important as a transition period. So things are good, but then in 722 BC, so about 700 years before Jesus is born, the Assyrian Empire conquers Israel. The 10 tribes of Israel were scattered to other lands and disappeared from history. Judah, though, survived and was able to fight off Assyria. However, Judah soon found itself the battleground between two warring groups, the Egyptians and what are called the New Babylonians. Egypt conquers Judah first, and then the Babylonians capture Judah. Eventually, Judah rebels, right? And if you're familiar with some Old Testament history, this is where you get Judah and the Maccabees. So Judah rebels, and the king of Babylon invades Jerusalem. And they destroy Jerusalem, including Solomon's temple, which is this image over here. And that's where the story of Hanukkah comes from, right? So the Jewish people were kind of holding out hope that they could fight off the Babylonians. And they end up holed up in this temple, um, and they're kind of surrounded by the Babylonians, and they figure out that they need light, right? They need light, they need warmth, and they have candles in there, and the candles are only meant to last for a little while. But the story goes, and again, whether you take this literally or kind of take it with a grain of salt, the story goes that those candles lasted for 8 nights. And so that's why we have the 8 nights of Hanukkah. Okay. But long story short, the temple does fall and the temple does get destroyed. Um, and for the Jewish people, as we see here, this means that the age of kings is over, and it ushers in, or it brings in, this era of exile. So exile is as we see here highlighted, is the forced removal from one's native country, right? So the Hebrew people who were living in their home country were forced out, and forced to kind of uh, spread out to other parts of the world. And so it's at this time that they build their first synagogues, um, and because of this division, the Jewish people kind of say, yeah, we've been fighting amongst ourselves for a little while, amongst our 12 tribes, but we're still united by being Jewish, and we're still united by being exiled and removed from our land. And so they actually start to unite, even from miles and miles away. And eventually, this kind of becomes the foundation of a lot of Jewish culture, is that um, they had their land and they were kings there. They lived like kings essentially, um, and they're exiled from their land, and that's where we get this idea of the promised land, right? God promised Abraham that if he worshipped him, um, the Jewish people would have a land to call their own. And with this exile, they end up being forced to move away from their land. And so the goal becomes to like return to the promised land, or return to the place that was promised to them by God, according to the Torah. Um, okay. So Cyrus the Great, he's a Persian king. He conquers Babylon in 539 BC. We learned a little bit about Cyrus the Great in the past. Um, he was a very tolerant leader, and he allowed people to keep their own customs and beliefs. And so when Cyrus, who's not Jewish, right? Cyrus is not Jewish. When he takes over Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah, he lets the Jewish people practice their own religion, and he lets them return to their homeland and rebuild their state. Um, Now, a lot of Jewish people, even though they're allowed to come back, they do decide to stay in the places that they've moved out to. But eventually, they come back and build what's called the Second Temple of Jerusalem. Um, right, and at this time, they also finalize the Hebrew Bible, as which also known as the Torah, and uh, they kind of usher in this new era of Judaism that looks more like the modern version of Judaism today, right? And if you look to the left, you'll see this is a picture of people praying at the Western Wall. Um, the Western Wall is basically all that remains of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, because that temple ends up getting destroyed as well, which we'll read about in a moment. And so the Western Wall is it kind of represents the promise between God and Abraham, right? It's where people go to pray to God. They write prayers on little like pieces of paper and stick them in the wall. Um, this is kind of like for Jewish people that go to visit Israel. This is kind of like the uh, holiest place, the most important place to go, because of what it represents and how powerful of a spiritual experience it is. Okay, so I mentioned that the second temple gets destroyed, right? And the second temple is actually where we get the story of Hanukkah, right? Um, the first time the temple gets destroyed, um, it just gets destroyed. With this second temple is where we get the story of Hanukkah. But basically, eventually the Syrian Empire called the Seleucids conquers Judah, and they treat them well until about 168 BC. And then, as it says, things start to change because they force the Jewish people to worship the Greek gods. Um, and they're led by a family called the Maccabees, right? Judah and the Maccabees, and their army fights against the Seleucids, um, and they rename this temple. They rededicate it back to Judaism, away from the Greek gods. And again, that's where that story of Hanukkah comes from. However, beginning a few hundred years later, the Roman Empire, takes control of Jerusalem and the region. And at first, they let the Jews have some freedom, but eventually, the Romans forced the Jews to call or to worship Roman gods. Eventually, the Jewish people get angry enough that they rebel, but the Roman army, which is the greatest army in the world at this time, destroys a lot of Jerusalem, including the Second Temple. Um, and eventually, the Jews are forced to leave again and settle again in new places. So, again, we start with the Babylonian exile, which happens when Babylon comes in and conquers Jerusalem. Then the Jews live peacefully for a little bit of time, but eventually the Romans conquer it and force the Jews to move out um, even further across the globe. And again, this is when especially the idea of a Jewish identity or a Jewish culture begins, um, because again, they're being forced, as you can see here, right? They're being forced away from their homeland, right? The Israel and Jerusalem was promised to them by God, as the story goes. It was promised to them by God, and they're being forced out of their home for the second time in a couple hundred years. So, um, as you can see, they're forced into Europe, into parts of Africa, into parts of Asia. Um, and even though they're hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from the Holy Land or the Promised Land, they still retain this Jewish identity, and this Jewish culture. Um, and and that kind of unites them through the years. And again, there's still this idea that um, you know there's still built into Jewish culture and identity the importance of Israel, as because it goes back to this time where they were forced out by conquering armies, right? And that's what's called the diaspora. A diaspora is, again, it's basically an exile. People are where people are forced out of their land and kind of spread to a number of different places. And so the last thing we'll end on is what the book says here. The legacy of the Jewish people is important in world history. It was the first monotheistic religion, so the first religion to worship just one God. Its emphasis on justice and morality influenced later religions, including Christianity. And it also had a great influence on other aspects of Western civilization, such as law, which comes from the Ten Commandments. So um, I'm going to leave this map up here, and this is going to be like your last question for the Ed puzzle, and that is just based on what I just talked about. I want you to explain this map. Like, what does this map mean? Um, yeah. All right.